I'd heard rumors about her, of course. Whispers in the dojo, hushed conversations amongst the instructors. Natasha Reed, a force of nature, a prodigy, and apparently completely bonkers. She's incredible, Tyler, my now former personal trainer Mark had said, shaking his head in disbelief. Black belt in multiple disciplines, undefeated in competition, but she faints at the sight of blood. Faints? I'd asked, incredulous. A martial artist who faints at the sight of blood? Yep, Mark had confirmed. Saw it myself. Guy got a nosebleed during sparring. She went down like a sack of potatoes. I'd filed that information away, intrigued. It was unusual, to say the least, and, frankly, a little hilarious. At that point, I had no idea that this quirky detail about a woman I'd never met would soon become incredibly relevant to my life. Then my life turned upside down. I had to see for myself. So I went. I witnessed it. This woman with muscles on muscles, effortlessly, almost artistically, subduing a group of 5 rather large and angry-looking thugs without a single drop of blood being spilled. It was like watching a beautifully choreographed dance, a ballet of perfectly timed blocks, throws, and joint locks. It was also, admittedly, a little terrifying. I heard her inner monologue then. An assumption, of course. I don't actually hear voices, usually. I can break a board with my bare hand, but a paper cut? Nope, out. This is why I can't have nice things. Or a normal career. The thugs were groaning, clutching various limbs, but otherwise unharmed. Natasha Reed, meanwhile, was dusting off her workout clothes, her expression a mixture of annoyance and… was that boredom? She had a dream, apparently. My private investigator had uncovered it, amongst her other personal details, to open her own martial arts school. A noble, if somewhat violent, ambition. And according to my sources, she had a rather significant and unrequited crush on one of the instructors at her current dojo, a certain Ben, a man who, from the photos I'd seen, appeared to have more hair than brain cells. This Natasha Reed was a puzzle, a fascinating, frustrating, potentially life-saving puzzle. And I, Tyler Wayne, reluctant billionaire and connoisseur of fine hypoallergenic bedding, was about to try and solve it. I'd never considered myself a wimp. Sheltered, certainly. Overprotected, definitely. Allergic to approximately 75% of the known universe, absolutely. But a wimp? That seemed a bit harsh. And yet, as I watched Natasha Reed, this whirlwind of controlled aggression and barely contained impatience, from across the room, I couldn't help but feel inadequate. She radiated strength, confidence, a complete mastery of her physical self. I, on the other hand, was currently battling a particularly aggressive dust bunny and losing. My life, up until this point, had been a carefully curated series of controlled environments. Climate-controlled offices, hypoallergenic bedding, organic, locally sourced, allergen-free meals prepared by a personal chef. I'd been groomed since birth to take over Wayne Enterprises, a responsibility I'd always viewed with a mixture of dread and resignation. I preferred the company of algorithms to actual humans, and my idea of a strenuous workout was a brisk walk on a treadmill set to a gentle incline. Then there was the incident. A seemingly minor mishap, a loose railing on the balcony of my penthouse, a sudden loss of balance, a terrifying near fall that left me dangling precariously over a 50-story drop. It was ruled an accident, a freak occurrence, but I knew better. My family, they were complicated. Let's just say that cutthroat was a word often used to describe the Wayne family dynamics. And my recent reluctance to fully embrace my role as CEO had made me unpopular. I suspected foul play. I needed protection. But not just any protection. I needed someone unconventional. Someone like Natasha Reed. I could practically hear her inner monologue, judging me from across the room. This guy is the heir to a billion-dollar empire? He looks like a strong breeze could knock him over. She wasn't wrong. A strong breeze could probably knock me over. I had the bone density of a particularly fragile bird, but I also had a brain. And that brain was telling me that this woman, this blood-phobic martial arts master, was exactly what I needed. Tracking her down was surprisingly easy. Turns out, a woman who can single-handedly subdue 5 grown men leaves a bit of a digital footprint. I found her at her dojo, teaching a class of giggling preteen girls how to execute a perfect roundhouse kick. It was unsettling. I waited until the class was over, approaching her with a carefully rehearsed speech about personal safety, corporate espionage, and the need for discreet, highly skilled protection. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of boredom and disbelief. I could practically see the eye roll forming in her mind. "You want me to be your bodyguard?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yes," I said, trying to project an air of confident authority that I definitely didn't feel. "I've seen your skills. You're impressive." She snorted. "I'm a martial arts instructor, not a babysitter." "It's not babysitting," I protested, perhaps a bit too quickly. "It's strategic protection, high-level security. Think of it as performance art with the potential for extreme violence." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I'm not interested." And that's when I played my trump card. "I'm prepared to offer you a salary of—" I named a figure that was, frankly, obscene, enough to buy her dream dojo several times over. Her eyes widened just slightly. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flicker of interest. I heard her internal monologue loud and, surprisingly, clear. "He's offering how much? Okay, maybe I can tolerate a few nosebleeds for that kind of money. My dream dojo is calling." "A few nosebleeds?" I asked aloud before I could stop myself. Damn it, had I imagined that? She blinked, startled. "Did you say something?" "No," I said quickly. "Just clearing my throat." "So, Miss Reed, do we have a deal?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond my shoulder. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head, the internal battle between her common sense and her lifelong dream. Finally, she sighed. "Fine," she said, "but I have conditions." And so it began. My life with the billionaire's bodyguard. I had a feeling it was going to be anything but boring. The day Natasha Reed moved into my penthouse was the day my carefully curated, meticulously controlled world imploded. I'd anticipated a certain level of adjustment. I knew she wouldn't exactly blend seamlessly into my hypoallergenic minimalist existence, but I hadn't anticipated the sheer force of her personality. She arrived with a single duffel bag, a suspicious-looking collection of wooden weaponry, and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. My staff, who were accustomed to my eccentricities, were visibly bewildered. My personal chef, Jean-Pierre, nearly fainted when Natasha requested a post-move-in meal of something with protein, preferably not resembling a work of art. I attempted to lay down some ground rules. Things like, "Please refrain from practicing high kicks in the living room," and "The antique Ming vase is not a suitable target for your nunchucks." She, in turn, presented her own list, which included no whining, mandatory training sessions, and absolutely no touching my protein bars. The culture clash was immediate and, frankly, hilarious. She looked at my penthouse, with its acres of marble, its floor-to-ceiling windows, its state-of-the-art everything, with an expression of utter disdain. I could practically hear her inner monologue. "This place has more marble than a Roman emperor's bathroom. And he has a personal chef? I live on ramen and protein bars." She was right, of course. It was excessive, but it was also home. Or at least, it had been. Now, it felt like a stage set for a very strange, very unpredictable play. She unpacked her meager belongings in the guest suite, which, to be fair, was larger than most apartments, transforming it into a bizarre hybrid of minimalist dojo and college dorm room. The scent of sandalwood and something vaguely medicinal began to permeate the air, battling with my carefully calibrated aromatherapy system. I tried to be accommodating, to make her feel comfortable. I offered her a tour of the penthouse, explained the intricate workings of the smart home system, and introduced her to the staff. She responded with a series of grunts, nods, and the occasional, barely perceptible eye roll. It was clear that this working relationship was going to be challenging. But beneath the awkwardness, the culture clash, and the looming threat of accidental impalement by a flying nunchuck, I felt a flicker of something else. Excitement? Anticipation? Or maybe it was just the adrenaline rush of knowing that my life was about to become infinitely more interesting. Natasha's idea of training was, to put it mildly, barbaric. I'd envisioned a few gentle stretches, perhaps some light calisthenics. What I got was a grueling, sweat-drenched, near-death experience. She started with a warm-up that involved more running than I'd done in the past decade. Then came the exercises, a series of increasingly complex and painful contortions that seemed designed to test the limits of human flexibility and my sanity. "This is supposed to be self-defense?" I gasped, collapsing onto the floor after a particularly brutal round of something. "It's conditioning," she replied, unfazed. "You need to build strength, stamina, and agility." "I need to build a time machine and go back to before I hired you," I muttered under my breath. She, of course, heard me. "Whining is not part of the training regimen, Tyler," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "I tried everything to get out of it. I feigned illness, injury, even a sudden onset allergy to exercise. She saw through every ruse, dragging me back to the mat with a terrifying combination of steely determination and utter lack of sympathy. Her internal monologue during that first session. "I've faced down black belts. I've taken on gangs. But this is my greatest challenge yet." The statement reverberated with exhaustion. I was flattered that at the very least she was challenged. Then there was the nosebleed incident. A perfectly ordinary nosebleed, the kind I'd experienced countless times throughout my allergy-ridden life. But to Natasha, it was apparently a sign of the apocalypse. She went pale, her eyes widened, and she let out a small, strangled sound. Then she promptly fainted. I, the fragile, allergy-prone billionaire, ended up comforting my bodyguard, the woman who could break a man in half with her bare hands. I fetched her water, fanned her with a magazine, and even, at her instruction, applied a cold compress to the back of her neck. It was, without a doubt, the most bizarre experience of my life. And yet, amidst the absurdity, I felt a strange tenderness towards her. This fierce, independent, blood-phobic warrior was, underneath it all, surprisingly vulnerable. It was also, I realized, the first time she'd actually needed me. And that, strangely enough, felt good. My attempts to avoid corporate responsibilities were, shall we say, less than successful. Natasha Reed, it turned out, was not easily deterred. She had a knack for seeing through my elaborate fabrications, my feigned illnesses, my desperate pleas for just one more hour of blissful, work-free existence. "You have a board meeting in 15 minutes, Tyler," she'd say, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "But Natasha," I'd whine, clutching my stomach, "I think I'm coming down with something. A rare tropical disease, perhaps, contracted from a houseplant." Her inner monologue, I could almost hear it crystal clear. He claims he has a rare tropical disease he contracted from a houseplant? Seriously? She'd simply raise an eyebrow, fold her arms, and give me that look. The look that said, "I'm not buying it, and you're going to that meeting, even if I have to carry you there myself." And she would. She'd literally drag me, sometimes kicking and screaming, mostly screaming, to the boardroom, ensuring I arrived on time and relatively presentable. It was humiliating. It was infuriating. It was also surprisingly effective. I started attending meetings, not because I wanted to, but because it was easier than facing Natasha's wrath. And to my surprise, I discovered that I wasn't entirely useless in the corporate world. I had a sharp mind, a knack for strategy, and a surprisingly good understanding of the market. What I didn't have was the stomach for the cutthroat politics, the backstabbing, the endless posturing. That's where Natasha came in. She'd sit in on the meetings, silent and watchful, her presence a subtle but unmistakable deterrent to any potential shenanigans. She didn't understand the intricacies of corporate finance, but she understood people. She could spot a liar, a manipulator, a threat, a mile away, And surprisingly, she started to offer her own insights. She'd ask pointed questions, challenge assumptions, and offer surprisingly astute observations. She had a knack for cutting through the BS and getting to the heart of the matter. The board members, initially intimidated by her presence, began to respect her. They saw her competence, her loyalty, her value. And so did I. Natasha Reed, the blood-phobic martial artist, was turning out to be a surprisingly effective business partner. And I, the reluctant billionaire, was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as useless as I'd always believed. There was a man. Of course there was a man. And not just any man, but Ben, the bane of my currently very complicated existence. Ben, the star pupil at Natasha's dojo, was everything I wasn't. Tall, muscular, tanned, and possessing a truly alarming amount of self-confidence. He also had, in my opinion, a truly unfortunate hairstyle. It was excessive, like a particularly fluffy, overgroomed poodle. Natasha, for reasons I could not fathom, harbored a rather significant crush on this specimen. She'd blush whenever he spoke to her, laugh at his unfunny jokes, and generally behave in a manner that was completely out of character for the stoic, no-nonsense woman I'd come to appreciate. I witnessed their interactions with a growing sense of unease. I'd accompany Natasha to the dojo for her evening classes, partly for protection, partly because I was, admittedly, fascinated by her world. I'd sit in the corner, pretending to read, while actually observing the two of them with the intensity of a hawk eyeing its prey. He'd spar with her, all unnecessary touching and smirking. She'd smile at him, a genuine, unguarded smile that I rarely saw directed at me. It was infuriating. Inner monologue. Tyler's POV. Why is she smiling at him like that? He's clearly an imbecile, and his hair is excessive. I knew it was irrational. I knew it was unprofessional. I knew it was completely inappropriate for a billionaire CEO to be jealous of a martial arts instructor with questionable hair. But I couldn't help it. The feeling was unfamiliar. I'd never experienced jealousy before. At least not to this degree. I'd always been the object of desire, the one pursued, the one in control. Now, I was the outsider, the observer, the loser. And it stung. It stung more than I cared to admit. It stung more than a paper cut from an endangered species of bamboo, a surprisingly common occurrence in my life. I had to do something. I had to intervene. But how? I couldn't exactly challenge Ben to a duel. I'd probably faint before I even threw a punch, assuming I could throw a punch, which was highly unlikely. No, I needed a different approach. A more subtle approach. A plan began to form in my mind, a plan so cunning, so devious, so utterly ridiculous that it just might work. Natasha's passion for martial arts was intimidating, and also surprisingly inspiring. I'd always viewed it as a hobby, a quirky quirk, a means of self-defense. I hadn't realized it was her life. She took on a new student, a young woman named Emily. Emily was, by all accounts, an underdog. Small, shy, and lacking in natural talent, she was the antithesis of Ben, the dojo's star pupil. But Natasha saw something in her, something that others had missed. A spark of determination, a willingness to learn, a quiet strength that belied her unassuming exterior. I watched Natasha work with Emily, patiently guiding her, correcting her form, encouraging her every step of the way. She was a different person when she was teaching. Her usual stoicism vanished, replaced by a warmth, a passion, a genuine desire to help others discover their own potential. She'd spend hours with Emily, drilling her on basic techniques, pushing her to her limits, but always with a sense of kindness and respect. She celebrated Emily's small victories, offered constructive criticism, and never, ever gave up on her. It was beautiful. I found myself drawn to the dojo, not just to observe Natasha, but to witness this transformation, this blossoming of confidence and skill. I saw the way Emily looked at Natasha, with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. And I realized that Natasha wasn't just teaching martial arts. She was teaching life lessons. She was empowering others, giving them the tools to defend themselves, not just physically, but emotionally as well. It made me see her in a new light. It made me admire her even more. And it made me realize that my initial assessment of her, as a tough, no-nonsense bodyguard, was woefully incomplete. She was so much more than that. She was a teacher, a mentor, a force for good. And I, the pampered, sheltered billionaire, was starting to fall even harder. Living with Natasha Reed was a constant exercise in navigating awkward situations. Our lives, so vastly different, were now intertwined in a way that was both hilarious and increasingly unsettling. There was the near fall in the shower incident. I'd slipped on a rogue bar of artisanal soap, lavender scented naturally, and she'd caught me, preventing a potentially catastrophic head injury. We'd ended up in a tangle of limbs, our faces inches apart, my heart pounding like a drum solo. She'd smelled of sandalwood and sweat, a surprisingly intoxicating combination. Then there was the late-night snack incident. I'd ventured into the kitchen, craving a midnight snack. Organic, gluten-free, of course, and found her there, already raiding the refrigerator. We'd ended up sharing a container of her protein-rich, my surprisingly palatable, vegan ice cream, engaging in a surprisingly normal conversation about everything and nothing. And then there was the date misunderstanding. My assistant, bless her overly efficient heart, had scheduled a business dinner with a potential investor, a woman who, unbeknownst to me, was also a notorious flirt. Natasha, seeing the entry in my calendar, had assumed it was a date. The resulting conversation was strained. "So," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral, "you have a date tonight?" "It's not a date," I'd insisted, feeling my face flush. "It's a business meeting." "With a woman," she'd pointed out, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," I'd admitted, "but it's purely professional." "Right," she'd said, her tone dripping with skepticism, "and I'm the Queen of England." I could almost palpably hear her inner monologue. Okay, maybe sharing a bathroom with a ridiculously attractive billionaire isn't as easy as I thought it would be. The evening had ended with me canceling the business dinner and ordering takeout pizza, which Natasha had devoured with gusto, while I picked at a gluten-free, dairy-free, taste-free alternative. These moments, these accidental brushes with intimacy, were becoming increasingly frequent, increasingly intense. They were throwing me off balance, disrupting my carefully constructed world, and making me question everything I thought I knew about myself, and about Natasha Reed. The lines were blurring, the boundaries were shifting, and I was starting to feel like I was standing on very shaky ground. And, strangely enough, I didn't entirely hate it. Meeting Tyler's family was like stepping into a different dimension. A dimension where money talked, manners were weaponized, and everyone looked like they'd been dipped in bleach and Botox. They arrived en masse, descending upon the penthouse like a flock of perfectly coiffed vultures. There was the matriarch, Eleanor, a woman with a voice like a steel trap and a gaze that could curdle milk. There was the older brother, Reginald, a smarmy, entitled jerk who looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. And there were various aunts, uncles, and cousins, all radiating an air of icy disapproval. It was immediately clear that they hated me. They hated my clothes, too casual. They hated my job, too physical. They hated my background, too common. And they especially hated the fact that I was standing between them and their precious Tyler, and his even more precious inheritance. "So, Natasha," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension, "tell me about your qualifications." "I can stop a grown man with my bare hands," I replied sweetly, "and I'm surprisingly good at dodging awkward questions." Reginald snorted. "A bodyguard? Really, Tyler? Couldn't you find someone a bit more suitable?" "Suitable?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Suitable for what? Protecting him from paper cuts? Because I'm pretty sure he can handle those on his own." The conversation, if you could call it that, went downhill from there. They made snide remarks about my lack of social graces, my unrefined upbringing, and my general unsuitability as a potential anything in Tyler's life. Inner monologue. They think I'm not good enough for him? Please, I could break them all in half with my pinky finger. I maintained my composure, of course. I was, after all, a professional, but inside, I was seething. I wanted to unleash a flurry of perfectly executed roundhouse kicks, sending them all sprawling across the imported Italian marble floor. But I didn't, because that's not what Tyler wanted. He wanted me to be civil, to play the part of the polite, respectful bodyguard, to pretend that their thinly veiled insults didn't bother me. It was the hardest acting job I'd ever had, and it made me realize, with a growing sense of unease, that this fake relationship was becoming increasingly complicated. I wasn't just protecting Tyler from physical threats. I was protecting him from his own family. And that, I knew, was a battle I might not be able to win. After Emily, my underdog student, won her first tournament, a victory that was as surprising as it was satisfying, something shifted. Suddenly, everyone wanted to train with me. My classes were full, my waiting list was growing, and even Ben started paying attention. Ben. The object of my long-standing, mostly unrequited crush. The star pupil of the dojo. The golden boy of the martial arts world. The man who'd always treated me with a mixture of polite indifference and condescending amusement. He started complimenting my teaching skills, offering to help me with my training, and even flirting? It was subtle at first, a lingering touch, a suggestive smile, a casual invitation to grab a drink sometime. Inner monologue. Wait, Ben is flirting with me? This is either a dream come true or a sign of the apocalypse. I was conflicted. On the one hand, this was what I'd always wanted. To be noticed by Ben, to be seen as more than just one of the guys, to be desired. On the other hand, something felt off. It was too sudden, too convenient. He'd never shown any interest in me before, not when I was just another struggling martial artist. Now when I was gaining recognition, when I was associated with a billionaire, suddenly I was worthy of his attention? It made me question his motives. Was he genuinely interested in me? Or was he just interested in my newfound status, my proximity to wealth and power? And then there was Tyler. The thought of him, of his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, his everything, created a confusing knot of emotions in my stomach. I'd been so focused on Ben, on this idealized version of him I'd created in my head, that I'd almost forgotten about the man who was actually there for me, the man who saw me for who I was, blood phobia and all. I didn't know what to do. I was torn between the fantasy I'd always cherished and the reality that was unfolding before me. And the worst part was, I was starting to realize that the reality might be better. Seeing Natasha with Ben, it was like a punch to the gut. A slow, agonizing, gut-wrenching punch delivered by a man with far too much hair gel. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand by and watch her fall for that jock. I had to fight for her, even if it meant making a complete fool of myself, which, let's be honest, was highly likely. My first step? Self-defense lessons. I needed to prove to Natasha and to myself that I wasn't just a helpless, allergy-prone billionaire. I needed to show her that I could be strong, or at least slightly less pathetic. I hired the best instructor money could buy, a former Navy SEAL with a voice like gravel and a terrifyingly intense stare. He looked at me, assessed my lack of physical prowess, and sighed. "This is going to be a long process," he said, his voice devoid of any optimism. He wasn't wrong. My training sessions were a disaster. I tripped, I stumbled, I pulled muscles I didn't even know I had. I spent more time on the floor than on my feet. I was a walking, talking, and whining testament to the futility of trying to become a martial arts master in a matter of weeks. Inner monologue. I'm going to learn to fight. For her, this is going to be painful. I also tried to be more assertive. I attempted to engage in manly conversations with Ben, dropping hints about my non-existent athletic abilities and my very real financial resources. It backfired spectacularly. He just looked at me with a mixture of amusement and pity. I even tried to accidentally interrupt their training sessions, pretending to need Natasha's assistance with some urgent and entirely fabricated crisis. She saw through my ruse immediately, of course, and gave me that look, the one that said, "You're being ridiculous and I'm not amused." I was failing, miserably. I was making a fool of myself, alienating Natasha, and probably providing endless entertainment for Ben and the entire dojo. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Because beneath the embarrassment, the frustration, and the sheer physical exhaustion, there was a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, I could win her over. Not with money, not with power, but with effort. With genuine, clumsy, utterly ridiculous effort. And that, I realized, was a fight worth fighting, even if it meant ending up with a few more bruises. And a severely bruised ego. The charity gala was supposed to be a routine event, a chance to schmooze with potential investors, make a sizable donation to a worthy cause, and generally maintain the image of the socially responsible billionaire. It should have been easy. It should have been boring. It was anything but. Because he was there. Ben. The hair-gelled, muscle-bound, charisma-oozing bane of my existence. And he was, predictably, making a beeline for Natasha. I watched, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack, as he approached her, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Natasha, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. But she was also polite. Too polite. She was smiling, listening to his undoubtedly inane conversation, and even laughing. Inner monologue. Tyler's POV. I can't stand seeing her with him. I have to tell her something. I tried to intervene, to subtly steer her away from him, to insert myself into their conversation. But he was like a particularly persistent barnacle, clinging to her side, monopolizing her attention. I felt a surge of something. It was hot, intense, and utterly unfamiliar. It was jealousy. Pure, unadulterated, green-eyed jealousy, and it was consuming me. I watched them dance, his hand on her waist, her body moving gracefully in time with his. I watched him whisper something in her ear, making her laugh again. I watched the way other men looked at her, the admiration, the desire, and I snapped. I approached them, my expression carefully neutral, though I'm sure my eyes were blazing with a barely contained fury. "Natasha," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "May I have a word?" She looked at me, surprised, then excused herself from Ben with a polite smile. "What's wrong, Tyler?" she asked, concern in her eyes. "What's wrong?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What's wrong is that you're spending the entire evening flirting with that meathead." She blinked, taken aback. "I was not flirting," she said defensively. "I was being polite." "Polite?" I scoffed. "You were practically drooling over him." "I was not," she insisted, her cheeks flushing. "You were," I retorted, my voice laced with an accusation I instantly regretted. We stood there, glaring at each other, the tension thick and heavy between us. The music, the laughter, the chatter of the gala faded into the background. It was just us, locked in a battle of wills, a silent war of unspoken emotions. I knew I was being irrational. I knew I was being unfair. But I couldn't help it. I was overwhelmed by this feeling, this possessiveness, this need to have her to myself. And in that moment, I realized the depth of my feelings for her. I wasn't just attracted to her. I wasn't just intrigued by her. I was in love with her. And the thought terrified me. The announcement came like a punch to the gut. I was in the middle of packing, preparing to leave, to finally pursue my dream of opening my own dojo, when I saw it on the news. Billionaire heir Tyler Wayne to wed socialite Cassandra van der Linde. The headline flashed across the screen, accompanied by a picture of Tyler, looking stiff and uncomfortable, standing next to a woman who was the epitome of everything I wasn't. Blonde, polished, and perfectly, painfully détaillée, suitable. My heart shattered. It was a clean break, a swift, agonizing severing of all the hopes and dreams I hadn't even realized I'd been harboring. Inner monologue. He's engaged? To someone else, this can't be happening. I'm in love with a billionaire who's allergic to commitment, and probably everything else. It all made sense now. His family's disapproval, his sudden distance, the way he'd been avoiding me since our argument at the gala. He'd been trapped, cornered by his family's expectations, forced to choose between his duty and me. And he'd chosen duty. I felt a wave of nausea, a burning in my throat, a cold, hollow ache in my chest. I'd been so foolish, so naive, to think that we could ever have a future together. I was a martial arts instructor, a bodyguard, a woman who fainted at the sight of blood. He was a billionaire, an heir to an empire, a man destined for a life of privilege and responsibility. We were from different worlds, and those worlds had finally collided, leaving me crushed and broken in the wreckage. I finished packing, my movements numb and mechanical. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. I couldn't face him, couldn't bear to see him with her. I needed to leave, to escape, to lick my wounds and try to rebuild my shattered heart. I wrote him a note, a short, formal resignation letter, thanking him for the opportunity and wishing him well. I didn't mention my feelings, my heartbreak, my love. What was the point? It was over. I left the penthouse, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, my eyes burning with unshed tears. I walked away from the life I'd briefly glimpsed, the life I'd foolishly hoped might be mine. I walked away from Tyler Wayne. The meeting with my family was a farce, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to force me into a life I didn't want. They presented Cassandra Van Derlin, my intended, a woman who was as beautiful as she was vapid, a perfect embodiment of their shallow, materialistic world. They announced our engagement to the press, without my consent, without even a pretense of consulting me. They thought they had me cornered, trapped by their expectations, their wealth, their power. They were wrong. I stood there, listening to their pronouncements, their congratulations, their thinly veiled threats, and I felt nothing. A cold, detached indifference. I was done. Done with the charade, done with the expectations, done with trying to be someone I wasn't. I'm not marrying her, I said, my voice calm and steady. The room fell silent. My mother gasped. Reginald sputtered. Cassandra looked like she'd been slapped. "What did you say?" my mother hissed, her voice dangerously low. "I said," I repeated, louder this time, "I'm not marrying Cassandra. I'm not marrying anyone. I'm done." I walked out. I walked out of the meeting, out of the penthouse, out of the life they'd planned for me. I walked out and didn't look back. I had no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to find her. To find Natasha. I went to the dojo first, but she wasn't there. Her apartment next, but it was empty. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic started to set in. Where was she? Had she left? Had I lost her forever? Then I remembered. Her dream. The dojo she'd always wanted to open. I had the address, a rundown building in a forgotten corner of the city. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I drove there, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I parked the car, got out, and walked towards the building. And there she was. She was standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light inside, her duffel bag at her feet. She was leaving. "Natasha!" I called out, my voice hoarse. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. I ran towards her, closing the distance between us. I didn't know what I was going to say, what I was going to do. I just knew I couldn't let her go. I had to tell her. I had to tell her everything. I had to tell her that I loved her. Tyler. I reached her, breathless, my heart hammering against my ribs. She looked surprised and maybe a little scared, and utterly, heartbreakingly beautiful. "Natasha," I said, my voice rough, I need to tell you something." She didn't speak, just looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "I was wrong," I continued, the words tumbling out of me. "About everything. About my family, about my life, about you." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I let them control me. I let them dictate my choices. I let fear of losing everything, stop me from being honest, with you, with myself. I love you, Natasha, I blurted out, the words raw and vulnerable. I know it's crazy. I know it's unconventional. But it's true. I love your strength, your independence, your everything. And I'm willing to give up everything, my family, my inheritance, my life, to be with you. I waited, my heart in my throat, for her response. Her reaction was everything. Natasha, he loved me? The pampered, allergy-prone, ridiculously wealthy Tyler Wayne loved me? Inner monologue. He loves me, and I love him. Holy crap. It was surreal. It was terrifying. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever heard. All my doubts, all my insecurities, all my carefully constructed defenses, they crumbled in that moment. I saw him, really saw him for the first time. Not the billionaire heir, not the fragile, sheltered man-child, but the real Tyler. The man who'd fought for me, who'd risked everything for me, who'd finally found the courage to defy his family, his upbringing, his destiny. For me. Tyler? I said, my voice trembling. I couldn't finish the sentence. I couldn't articulate the whirlwind of emotions that were swirling inside me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I kissed him. I stepped forward, closed the distance between us, and pressed my lips to his. It was a tentative kiss at first, a hesitant exploration. But then he responded, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me closer, his kiss deepening, becoming passionate, demanding, all-consuming. It was a kiss that said everything we couldn't say with words, a kiss that sealed our fate, that bound us together, that declared our love to the world. Natasha. We returned to the penthouse, hand in hand, a united front against the storm we knew was coming. Tyler's family would be furious, devastated, and undoubtedly plotting their revenge. Tyler. I was prepared. I'd made my choice, and I was ready to face the consequences. Natasha. As we walked into the living room, we found them waiting for us. Eleanor, Reginald, Cassandra, and a few other assorted relatives, all looking like they'd just swallowed a lemon. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice dripping with ice. Tyler, what is the meaning of this? She demanded. You disappear. You reject Cassandra. You humiliate us. Tyler, I'm not marrying Cassandra, Mother, I said, my voice calm but firm. I'm not marrying anyone you choose for me. I'm marrying Natasha. A collective gasp went around the room. Cassandra looked like she was about to faint. Reginald sputtered something about disinheritance and insanity. Natasha. He loves me, I said, stepping forward, my voice clear and strong. And I love him, and that's all that matters. Eleanor turned to me, her eyes narrowed. You, she sneered. You're nothing but a common thug. You're not good enough for my son. My hands clenched into fists. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that violence was not the answer most of the time. Tyler. She's everything to me, I said, my voice taking on steel, cutting my mother off. She's strong, she's honest, she's real, and she's the only woman I'll ever love. I turned to Natasha, taking her hand, my gaze locking with hers. I choose you, I said, the words echoing in the silent room. I choose us, Natasha. And with that, we walked out. We walked out on his family, on their expectations, on their suffocating control. We walked out and into our future, a future that was uncertain, unpredictable, but filled with a love that was stronger than anything they could throw at us. Life after the great Wayne family implosion was surprisingly peaceful. Tyler's family, predictably, disowned him, but he didn't seem to care. He'd shed the weight of their expectations like an ill-fitting suit, and he was finally free to be himself. And I, to my utter shock, was finally able to realize my dream. With Tyler's very generous support, I opened Reed's Renegades, my own martial arts school. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't in a prime location, but it was mine. I filled it with the best equipment, hired the best instructors, including a very humbled and surprisingly respectful Ben, and created a space where people of all ages and abilities could learn, grow, and discover their own inner strength. Tyler, meanwhile, surprised everyone by not abandoning the corporate world entirely. He stepped down as CEO of Wayne Enterprises, but he remained on the board, using his influence to steer the company in a more ethical, sustainable direction. He also started investing in new ventures, supporting small businesses, and funding research into alternative energy and medical advancements. He even, to my continued amusement, insisted on continuing his self-defense lessons. He was still terrible, of course, but he was determined. And that, I realized, was what I loved most about him. His willingness to try, to learn, to grow. And of course, I remained his personal bodyguard. Not because he needed it, although, let's be honest, he still needed it, but because it was us. It was a symbol of our unconventional relationship, a reminder of how we'd met, how we'd fallen in love, how we'd fought for our future. Tyler. Life with Natasha was never boring. It was a constant adventure, a whirlwind of activity, a chaotic but beautiful dance between two very different people who had somehow, miraculously, found each other. Natasha. Our relationship deepened, evolving beyond the initial spark of attraction, the thrill of rebellion, the comfort of shared vulnerability. We learned to navigate our differences, to compromise, to support each other's dreams. We learned to love each other fully and completely. Tyler. I learned to appreciate the simple things: a quiet evening at home, a shared meal, a walk in the park, with Natasha constantly scanning for potential threats, of course. I learned to embrace spontaneity, to let go of control, to trust in the unpredictable nature of life. Natasha. I learned to accept help, to lean on someone else, to allow myself to be vulnerable. I learned that strength wasn't just about physical power, but about emotional resilience, about the courage to love and be loved. I learned that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with fists, but with an open heart. Tyler. We still trained, of course. Natasha insisted on it, and to my surprise, I started to enjoy it. I was never going to be a martial arts master, but I was getting better, stronger, more confident. Natasha and I, the blood-phobic black belt, finally confronted my fear. With Tyler's support, I started working with a therapist. Slowly, gradually, desensitizing myself to the sight of blood. It was a long, difficult process, but I was determined to overcome it. Not just for myself, but for us. Tyler. Our love story was unconventional, messy, and utterly perfect. Natasha. It was a story of two unlikely people, brought together by fate, who found strength, love, and a whole lot of laughter in the most unexpected of places. It was our story, and it was just beginning.